we go into our actual agenda, I would like for us to start this meeting in a similar way that we started yesterday's, when we took inspiration from one of North Carolina's true education heroes in our past and celebrated Dr. Bridges. And so I'd like for us to begin this meeting by celebrating one of our current North Carolina education heroes, Dr. Bev Emery.
So Bev, would you stand with?
So, Bev has shared with us that her whole professional career has been devoted to our students, and that a number of the meaningful events that shaped her lifelong devotion to our students happened in her own education at a small but mighty Ohio school called Oberlin College. It happens to be the same Oberlin College that in the late 1800s sent their best teachers to this state and this town to educate newly freed citizens and to work with them to build a community of prosperity and hope for their children, which today is enshrined in our own Oberlin Middle School and the road that many of us travel on here in Raleigh. We were glad then, but we're even more glad now that Oberlin College sends North Carolina their best. Bev has spent her whole career in nearly every area of responsibility in teaching and leading teachers for our students, including a stint as the Pitt County Superintendent and the Winston-Salem Forsyth Superintendent, and most recently leading what I would say is probably the most important work our state has done in education. In every one of those endeavors, Bev has given her all her time, all her talent, all of her energy, and most of all of her love. There's millions of students, current and former, their families, their teachers, their educators, that have a better life today because they were touched by Bev Emery. And every one of us in this room is included in that number. So if you would, join me in thanking our colleague and friend, Bev Emery.
Well, thank you. This was a nice surprise. So I'm not prepared, and that's probably good for y'all, right? When Eric was talking about Oberlin, I was thinking about how much I learned from kids. And I know we've talked about that yesterday, and we'll talk about that today. But I guess my greatest wish in retirement, one day I think, oh, I'm going to coach or consult. And the next day I think I'm going to wear flip-flops and 10 bar. And never look back, But I reflect back on all those amazing stories. So one of my real goals in the new year is to write down about skunks and bears and protests and being in Oberlin when after 9/11 we went to war, and the Oberlin College students, all 2,000 of them, protested on our high school, in front of our high school. And we're trying to get the high school kids to come out of the school and protest with them. And the Oberlin Barney Fife Sheriff's Department showed up with their dogs and their guns and their boots. And I thought, oh, Jesus, please, help us. Seriously, right? Scary moment when students literally started breaking windows in the high school and crawling in, and you're not sure what it is you're going to do in that moment, right? And sometimes it's just pray. And I think we face a lot of those moments right now about unique situations that happen for leaders and schools and what are we going to do with them? So thank you all. This has just really been a joyful ride. I told Superintendent Truitt when I talked to her a few months ago, you know, the last thing I want to be is that person that everybody's going, oh my gosh. And so it's hard to make the decision in terms of timing, but it has been really good for me. I never thought I would grow up and go to the Department of Public Instruction. It was not one of those things I thought to do. And now I look back and say, the Lord really was helping me grow to a point of being ready to get to the next step. And I cannot say enough what a joy and a pleasure it has been to know all of you, to work with all of you, to get in the trenches during a pandemic with all of you, but mostly to know the heart of service that lives in this building, that lives on this board, that lives in our leadership, that we exist because they are out there and they need us every day. So keep it up. I had Mr. Lowry yesterday want to make sure he had the right phone number to reach me later. And my joke to him was, well, I got calls from 3 Winston-Salem Forsyth bus drivers over the weekend that I didn't know had my number. So I guess I can give it to you, Mr. Lowry. So I'm here for you.
Well, for an impromptu speech, that was awfully good. All right, we'll jump right into our agenda, and I'll turn to Mr. McKinney to introduce our next speaker. Freeberg.
Good morning, everyone. It is a great honor to introduce our next speaker and my friend. And just real briefly, when you have the honor of serving as the North Carolina State Teacher of the Year, one of the greatest experiences being able to share that with all of the other state teachers of the year across our country. And I'm so excited that Maureen is engaged in that process now, and that Eugene is about ready to engage in that journey as well. And on this journey, I had the honor and privilege to meet Miss Stacy McAdoo, and she is the Arkansas State Teacher of the Year, the 2019 State Teacher of the Year. And she currently serves as the Director of Teach Plus, which is an initiative in Arkansas to recruit and retain teachers of color, particularly getting educators more engaged in policymaking. And knowing that this is something that our state is definitely focused on, how do we recruit and retain teachers, particularly teachers of color, but also how do we orchestrate a mechanism that allows for teacher voices to not only be at the table, but also help set the table in education policymaking decisions. So it is a great honor for her to share her story and her initiative in Arkansas. And Stacy, I will now hand it over to you, my friend.
Okay, hello. Can everyone hear me? Freeberg, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Let me turn the mute off. So for whatever reason, I'm having difficulty with the sound on my computer, but if you guys can hear me, I'm going to just go this way. So thank you for being patient with me. I'm going to share my screen now. So first of all, I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. McKinney and Dr. Townsend Smith for the engaging conversation we had a couple weeks ago and the invitation to share my journey with you all, to Chair Davis, Superintendent Truitt, Vice Chair Duncan, Lieutenant Governor Robinson, and all these distinguished board members and guests. It's an honor to share this virtual space with you. I'm not sure how much of who I am they have shared with you. I heard Freebird's introduction, but I know that Dr. Townsend Smith and Freebird really vetted me because they insisted that I submit more documentation than you have to submit in order to get one of those new Real ID driver's license. Anyway, in a nutshell, for 19 years, up until this school year, I taught in the same district that I was educated in. In fact, I've lived in the same city of Little Rock all my life. My father-in-law has this quote that I often say, and it's everything is relative. And in comparison to the rest of the state, which is strongly conservative, Little Rock is considered a moderately liberal city. We've been struggling with race and racial inequities in education for a very, very long time. And I am beyond honored to not only have had the opportunity to spend nearly 2 decades teaching at the historic Little Rock Central High School, but also for having had the opportunity to meet and get to know those 9 brave souls who desegregated the school back in 1957, and more importantly, to carry their torch forward. My whole life has been all about loving and listening to and advocating for those who are marginalized. When I was little, I used to play school in my room, and I would line my dolls up, and Craig, my only sibling, and my little brother would be my only live pupil. Now, he didn't always want to play school, but once he started school, he would often say that mine was better. And I often found myself reteaching him the skills and content that he had a difficult time learning from his teachers. Back then, I didn't really understand or know words such as cultural competency or student-centered learning or culturally relevant teaching or any of those other academic terms that are ultimately about trying to see and value students for who they are. What I did know was that I always saw lots of other ways that I thought my teachers could or should have taught material to make it more interesting and appealing to me. And I'm convinced that part of the reason Craig was able to learn content more easily from me is because I understood his world and was able to fit it into the curriculum. Research from a report called I Am Here for a Reason revealed that teachers of color enter the profession mainly to right wrongs and to be bridge builders, as opposed to most whites who enter the profession because they were encouraged and inspired by a particular teacher. Those findings were definitely true for me, which is as to why I entered the profession. I wanted to be what I didn't see. I wanted to be what I didn't have. I wanted to be better than what I had. And I wanted to be what Craig needed. Now, I realize it's been a minute since some of us were students, but indulge me for a minute or two. I wish I were there with you in person so I could see your reaction. But just take your mind back to your school days. It may be helpful if you start with the end in mind, maybe graduation or college graduation, and then work your way back. Pretend like you have one yearbook full of only all your former teachers, those you loved and those you loved not as much. Now, as you scan the pages, pay close attention to the grade or the school level, like elementary, middle school, high school, and try to pinpoint the first time you had a teacher who looked like you. What grade was that in? What about the first time you had a teacher who did not look like you? Think about the subject areas they taught and what levels they taught. Were they core subjects, athletics, related arts, gifted and talented, grade level, special needs, advanced placement? This lady on the screen here is Mrs. Anderson. She would have been the first teacher I had who looks like me, but technically I don't get to claim her. She was my 7th grade teacher for maybe a week. She taught grade level English and kicked me out of class. She said that she knew on the first day of school or first day of class that I was inappropriately placed, and she had me moved into honors English. Now, when I tell you that I was devastated that I wasn't going to be able to have her as my English teacher, because y'all, I was so excited when I saw that I was going to have her. That doesn't even come close to describing my heartache. I knew that I was gifted and talented because my mama had been telling me that my whole life. But despite being above grade level in most subjects, I was never officially flagged as a GT student until her. And this experience is pretty consistent with what the research says about the benefits and impact African American teachers have on their students. Black educators typically refer more students of color into gifted and talented programs than their counterparts do. And they are generally less likely to refer students for disciplinary reasons or to special education. And I can count on my hand the number of Black teachers I've had throughout my education on one hand. Well, 2 extra fingers if I go all the way up into me working on this advanced graduate degree. And I'm lucky. My brother never had a single same gender, same race educator his entire educational career. And I don't want to insult you with a lot of statistics or data about the importance of a diverse teaching staff, because we're all pulling from the same research, and each of us knows that there's substantial evidence that shows all students, and in particular students of color, do better when they have diverse teachers. So the million-dollar question is, why are we having such a hard time recruiting them, and why are they leaving the workforce at a higher rate than white teachers? Asking that question is like asking which came first, the chicken or the egg. Although we may never solve that chicken and the egg riddle, we can solve our recruitment and retention issue. We know that recruitment and retention are 2 separate things, but we also know that the school culture and climate and the support that we offer are the secret sources that are needed for both of them. And this comes largely by how we do teacher preparation, teacher development, teacher leadership, teacher support, so that we have a culturally competent teacher delivering culturally responsive and rigorous curriculum in an environment that values and affirms everyone, not just the students, but the teachers, the classified staff, the parents, everybody. In every educator circle that I've been a part of for the last 2 decades, improving the teacher pipeline has come up in some shape, form, or fashion. Prior to COVID, my husband and I used to have these bi-monthly gatherings at my house called the Mind Blazing. And essentially, we'd invite all of our friends over, and our friends are a hodgepodge of individuals. Some are artists, some are educators, some are career students, entrepreneurs, doctors, attorneys, like people from all walks of life. And they would come over and we'd sit around and engage in conversation where we essentially solve the world's problems. But whenever a question about education came up, every non-educator in the room always had the answer. But that's a whole different story. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I guess the one consistent thing is when we think about our pipeline, we're always asking questions like, what's happened to our pipeline? And why is it leaking? How is it leaking? Where is it leaking? How do we really know it's leaking? Who said it's leaking? Who's evaluating the leaking? And how bad is it? Do we plug it, fix it, tear it down, or install a whole new one? If we listen to classroom practitioners or review recommendations from almost any group or organization that has researched or been immersed in this work, the levers on the screen are pretty much everyone's recommendation on how to stop the pipeline from leaking. This particular pipeline image that's on the screen comes from a report by Teach Plus Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Educator Diversity Consortium called Diversifying the Teacher Pipeline. And it's a toolkit for recruiting more high school students of color into teacher preparation programs in schools. Now, this pipeline issue isn't just a Pennsylvania issue or an Arkansas or North Carolina issue. It's a national issue. The research from 2018 shows that Black college students majoring in education has fallen by 60% across the nation since 1996. Fewer high school and college students are choosing teaching as a profession, and we know that if we want to turn it around, we have to start cultivating an interest in the teaching profession early, which means that in most cases, we need to not just change the narrative or combat a lot of misinformation that's out there, but we also really need to fix the school climate and culture and be intentional about highlighting and promoting teaching as a viable professional option. A few minutes ago, I asked you to create this mental yearbook where I told you to think about all of your teachers from the past. Let's kind of go back there for a second, back to our youth, and I want you to think about the first time you remember someone encouraged you to be a teacher or to go into education. Did anybody, when you were in grade school, elementary school, or what have you, say, "Oh my gosh, you're so smart. You make a great teacher," or "You're an amazing, outstanding leader. You'd be a wonderful teacher"? Sharif from the Center of Black Educator Development found that on average, white female teachers report having been encouraged to consider teaching by the time they reached the 3rd grade. But most Black male educators were never encouraged to become teachers, or if they were, it was at or around or even after they graduated from college. And there's some informal surveys that show that most current education students are actively discouraged from pursuing teaching by either a family member or some other adult in their life. Now, I mentioned when I started how I used to play school, in my room with my dolls and my little brother. What I didn't mention is that I used to lie about what it is that I wanted to be when I grew up. I knew I loved kids and helping people as long as I can remember. And I also know that me and science have never, ever been friends. But I would lie and I would say that I wanted to be a pediatrician because I quickly learned that that was way more prestigious, especially for little smart girls. And when I reflected on those questions that I just asked you about the first time you were encouraged to enter the profession, I personally couldn't think of single time or a single adult who did encourage me to become a teacher. So although Sharif's research didn't focus on Black females, something tells me that if he did, the results wouldn't be aligned with the 3rd grade experience cited by the white teachers that he researched. I remember every time I told somebody that I wanted to be a teacher, they always ask me, like when I finally tell people, which I'm a non-traditional teacher, so 2nd career, I came in afterwards, after my brother died. But every time I would tell them that I wanted to be a teacher, the first thing they would ask me was, "Are you sure?" And they always talked about how broken the system was, how bad the students were, how low the salaries were, and how disrespected teachers were. And that's sad. That's sad that individuals would discourage other individuals from entering the profession. And what's even sadder is that a lot of times it's the educators themselves that do this discouraging. One of the ways that Arkansas is attempting to repair our broken pipeline is by way of using Grow Your Own programs with this course. One of the ways of that Grow Your Own program is with this course called Educators Rising as the centerpiece. And as best as I can tell, unless it's happened recently or the affiliate list hasn't been updated, North Carolina doesn't offer this program. But this program is something that I piloted in Arkansas, and I was thoroughly impressed with it. It's a national Grow Your Own model, and it's in, I believe it's like 46 states. So it's growing. It's not statewide necessarily. There are lots of pockets in different states that use it. But prior to our Educators Rising program, our district, had the standard orientation to teaching or high school orientation to teaching classes. And at one point, we even offered a teacher cadet program. I never taught the teacher cadet program, so I don't have any lived experience experience with it or how different they are in implementation. I have looked at both of the curriculums, and I selected Educators Rising over the other ones. And what sold me on Educators Rising was that it's designed by teachers, for teachers, and it offers micro-credentials and certification pathways. It embraces social justice, and it's intentional about recruiting underrepresented populations, especially males and teachers of color. And in addition to this these micro-credentials, which are aligned to the certified teaching assistant and paraprofessional certifications, service learning, concurrent credit, field experience, and deep, meaningful partnerships between the district, the Department of Education, your co-ops, your institutions of higher education, and your teacher prep programs are the staples and the must-have components of the program. Now, the course has 6 very, very basic but very deep standards: understanding the profession, learning about students, building content knowledge, engaging in responsive planning, implementing instruction, and using assessments and data, and engaging in reflective practice. And all of the curriculum themes are centered around cultural competency, fairness, equity, diversity, reflective practice, collaboration, social justice, ethics, all of this stuff. So students are not only learning about the profession, but they're learning how to be culturally responsive and culturally competent and address current issues, trends, and everything in education. In addition to Arkansas using the Educator Rising course, we also have a requirement that all novice teachers are a part of this novice teacher mentoring program. And when I taught the Educators Rising class, I was in this hybrid role where half of me worked in the career and technical education department, and the other half of me worked for administration in the professional development department. And I was the lead novice teacher for the entire district, which, as you saw on the previous slide, is the largest urban district in Arkansas. So I had a lot of novice teachers that I was over. But there was a lot of bleed over in the things that I taught the novice teachers and the aspiring educators. So we were able to do service learning projects together. We were able to learn together in many instances. This here, I'm not really going to go into all the details on this slide, but I do want to point out that, Cherie's research stated that most white teachers were encouraged by the time they were in the 3rd grade. Now, Educators Rising doesn't start in elementary, but it does have clubs and chapters at the beginning as early as middle school, and the students then enroll in the Educators Rising class as a junior. And from there are multiple pathways to licensure. There are scholarships and grant money that's allocated for these students. And beginning next year, our state will be rolling out its new Arkansas residency model, which you'll see in another slide or two. So this is just some of the ways that our students are able to earn a free degree. And it's largely due to this Arkansas Future grant that we have, which is our newest state grant program. Students that are aspiring, high school students that are aspiring educators who go to school and utilize this free grant thing are required to be a part of an official mentoring program. So they're getting mentorship even before they enter the profession. This is that slide I was telling you about, the residential model that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And after a student gets into high school, when they earn their paraprofessional certification, then they're able to start going through these different levels. The first level is their CTA, and they're able to work in the schools. At this time, they're usually a freshman or a sophomore in college. Once they have been admitted into an education prep program, then they're able to, again, work in the schools as a certified person. And then that internship, that third level, allows them to actually fill teaching vacancies and serve as a classroom teacher, provided that they have a teacher leader that's assigned to them. Oh, let me go back. Are there, well, this may not quite work. Are there any questions before I transition to the next part? I will have time built. I do have time built in at the end of the presentation for questions. Okay, I'm gonna take that no as I'm gonna take that silent. Well, I see Audrey's screen coming up. Okay. So while I was in this hybrid role teaching aspiring educators and mentoring these novice teachers, I was on the advisory board for Teach Plus. And Teach Plus is a national nonprofit organization that was started in 2009 in Boston by a classroom practitioner who believes that teachers should have a say in the policies that affect them and their students. And the mission of Teach Plus is to empower teachers to take leadership over key policy and practice issues that advance equity, opportunity, and student success. We're currently in 11 states, and one of our equity focus areas is on the recruitment and retention of a diverse teaching force, where we work to break down the barriers that hinder teachers of color from entering, staying, and growing in the profession. Teach Plus is all about amplifying teacher voice and equipping them with the tools and resources to research and advocate for the policy changes that they want to see in place. And as an advisory board member, I think Freeberg, I remember hearing him talk about my interest in recruitment and retention, specifically in retention. That's what our focus groups were about. As the advisory board members, we end up conducting focus groups with teachers of color from all across the state, and we ask them to share their thoughts with us about their challenges, their experiences as it relates to being a teacher of color in education, and to share some of their suggestions and recommendations on how we, Arkansas, where 40% of our public school teachers are students of color, but only 12% of our teachers are. And last year we had, we had 68 school districts who didn't have a single teacher of color employed as the teacher of record. Anyway, we asked these individuals, how could we do better at creating culturally affirming schools and supportive school cultures for teachers? And we took that information that they shared with us and paired it with our research and what research was already out there. And we presented the findings to our State Board of Education and worked with the Public School Program Advisor and the Equity Assistance Center at our State Department, where our brief and recommendations were used to help restructure the guidelines for our district's recruitment and retention plan. Beginning next year, all of our districts are now going to have to create and post their 3-year minority teacher and administrator recruitment plan, because that was one of the things that our teachers talked about, were pathways to leadership and not feeling represented or supported in the efforts to become administrators and other non-teaching roles. I've included here some pictures of some of the other briefs and toolkits produced by Teach Plus policy fellows with recommendations on how to recruit and retain teachers of color and how to improve the teacher pipeline. They also, some of them also focus on teacher preparation at the collegiate level, faculty, the individuals who are preparing our teachers. Some focused on how to eliminate financial barriers and how to improve hiring practices and mentoring programs, not just for teachers, but also for students. This last slide is two of our latest projects, which are called To Be Who We Are and the Phoenix Project. And To Be Who We Are is a more extensive report on the retention of Black teachers. And the Phoenix Project is almost literally just hot off the press. It's a comprehensive design thinking initiative that took place last year and involved like 175 teachers from across 30 states. And the premise of it was we were dead smack in the middle of COVID or coming on the other side or what have you. And we were asking teachers to reimagine schools and how it could be, how schools could be, should be once we emerge from this pandemic, and how we could make it more equitable than ever. Both of these reports offer very, very specific ways to change the system. And finally, the other day, I wrote an op-ed for the Arkansas Times, and it was called When Teachers Lead. For this piece, I was asked to gaze into this crystal ball and predict what public education will look like here in Arkansas in the year 2050. Excuse me. And it was a really hopeful piece, and it was one where I envisioned the pipeline was booming and teachers are being listened to and valued and compensated like the professionals that they are. The demographics, including everyone from teachers to superintendents to the state leaders, are as diverse as the public school youth that we teach. And in my 2050 world, because of this visual, many black males who used to only represent about 2% of teachers now aspire to become teachers, not coaches or anything else, but teachers of all subjects, including early childhood. I've received a lot of comments and feedback from this piece. Some of them have expressed concern about whether we'll ever get there, and I'm confident that we will, because we have to. It's up to us to decide when we're going to get there. We know that our pipeline is broken. We have the research, the recommendations, and 3+ million educators warning us day in and day out that this current system isn't sustainable. It would be a shame if we waited until the whole system collapsed before we began to rebuild it. The time is now, and I would love the opportunity to dream, build, partner with DPI and the offices of Equity, Educator, Recruitment, and Support, Teacher Leadership Council and your task force, BEST NC, and all of the other organizations in your coalition. I truly believe that together we can eliminate the opportunity gap, improve school and district performance, and increase teacher preparation, not just for North Carolina or for Arkansas, but for every state in between us, around, and above us. So thank you once again for this opportunity to share and to share this time and space with you today. If you have any questions, I'm open to them and will try my best to answer them.
We have a question coming your way right now, Stacy.
Testing 1, 2. All right, we are live. Hi, Stacy.
Hello, how are you? I wish I
doing
could
fine.
see y'all.
Yeah, you can't see me. My name is James Ford. I'm a member of the state board, but I was 2014-15 state teacher of the year, and yeah, that's right. And I am the grandson of Arkansans, sharecroppers from Prescott, Arkansas, near Texarkana, so a little southwest, a little more rural than Little Rock, I believe. But
Yeah, you're giving me chills. Arkansas is in the house.
absolutely. Well, I wanted to thank you for this wonderful presentation and for raising our understanding and encouraging our learning on this topic. couple of things that, I thought that you highlighted nicely was the multiplier effect of having a teacher of color, right? That it's not just about, a more colorful palette of educators who are on a roster. It's like that teacher who within a week saw the necessity of moving you up into another classroom, right? It's the disciplinary impact. And we had plenty of conversation yesterday about restorative practices, et cetera. I appreciate you laying out the tactics. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the educator recruitment plans that y'all have in Arkansas for the districts. Can you talk a little bit more about those and what those are comprised of?
I would prefer not to, only because I personally do not work for the State Department of Education, and I would not want to not do it any justice. But what I can do is afterwards connect you to Charlie from the Department of Education, and she would be able to share those recruitment plans with you and the specific strategies.
That would be wonderful, and I appreciate you saying so. I asked because we had, as part of our last planning and work session, I believe, someone from Tennessee come and speak to a very similar issue, and they had a similar policy for their districts, and I just wanted to see how Arkansas has looked in comparison. One caveat I want to offer you, I don't know how it is in Arkansas, but regard to the chicken and the egg reference. So, the huge gap in teacher diversity that we see, a lot of times is cast as a mystery. But what is oftentimes unknown is that it is part of the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education, that when schools integrated children, they did not integrate the teaching staffs. In North Carolina alone, we lost 3,000 Black teachers and over 500 Black principals in the state during that period. And so when we see that gap, it's not purely due to a lack of interest. I want, as a history teacher, I want us to know there's a history, again, a trajectory that informs that. And so my argument I'm essentially making is that it's the egg. So, but
well,
I
received that, and I received that. I mentioned that I taught at Little Rock Central High School for almost 20 years. And when at the very beginning, I talked about race relations and racial inequities here in Arkansas. Our state did not want integration to happen so badly that when those 9 children desegregated Little Rock Central High, and I'm intentionally saying desegregated and not integrated because it was no two-way thing. It was literally the students coming into mainstream white America and not a merging of the two cultures. Our governor decided that he was so against it that he shut down public high schools in Little Rock for that next year. And a lot of people don't talk about the lost year, but that's how entrenched this racial inequity and this racial tension, even though we skate around it and we pretend that it's no longer there, a lot of our policies are still in place that are a result of all of that mess, all of those eggs from 60-something years ago, even longer than 60-something years ago. But thank you so much for engaging with me. I love hearing voices, even if I couldn't see you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
You have another question coming your way?
Okay.
A couple of things you mentioned that I'd like to go back to and get a little more information. Just the whole concept of the educators rising and the coursework that you offer. You're teaching that yourself? Is that being taught across high schools in Arkansas or just in Little Rock?
No, it's being taught throughout Arkansas. I piloted it last year, and so this is the first year that it's in lots of, well, I won't say lots of districts, but in other districts as well. So, yeah, it's an absolutely phenomenal program. And what we did with it is, and part of this may have been because I was in this hybrid role where I was working with the novice teacher program. But when we had our recruitment fairs and everything. Our aspiring educators were heavily involved in the planning of it and the workshops that we presented. So the high school students became a part of our recruitment plan as well. And there was something else I was going to mention about that partnership, but it escapes me now.
Thank you for that information. And the other thing I'm interested in hearing more about is there was a slide where you indicated that at least an associate degree could be tuition free. How is that funded?
So it's funded a couple of ways. We have the State Department allocated some funding when we were piloting it being the Educators Rising class course. There is some fees associated with that, but the Department of Education provided funding for it. In regards to the pathways, and let me see if I can get, I stopped. No, I'm still sharing my screen, right?
Yeah.
I can't, for whatever reason, can't get back to that slide. But there's a grant from the State Department that Arkansas, I can't think of the official name, but they have partnerships where they have worked with community colleges and traditional four-year colleges where they are granting grants for these students. And so when the students are in the Educators Rising course, we're doing concurrent credit. So depending on, I need to get back to that slide, depending on where we are in the state and what colleges are near that particular district are the schools that the districts partner with. But it's strictly a partnership between the school district, the State Department, and those higher institutions of higher education.
Thank you.
We also have some private funding that covered costs for this Educator Rising course, but not necessarily for the grants or any of those things. Those were initiated and allocated by the state primarily. Kind of like do you all have a lottery scholarship or anything like that? Like we have an Arkansas Challenge scholarship that is funded from lottery revenues.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate the information.
Stacy, we've been working right now. The state superintendent has designed a position for teacher engagement and lifting up teacher voices across the state through a teacher council. So we're really trying to be proactive in ways to elevate the teacher voice. With Teach Plus specifically, how do those teachers take off time during the year? Are there specific allotted days? Kind of how does that whole process work so that they're able to participate in conferences or task force or committees, knowing how much time it takes on a day-to-day basis as an educator? Could you kind of walk through a little bit of what that looks like?
And thank you for asking about that. So Teach Plus Arkansas is brand new. And when I say brand new, I just left the classroom this school year to come into this role and to start Teach Plus in Arkansas specifically. So we have a policy fellowship right now. We're meeting after school and on the weekends. The fellows do receive a small stipend for their time, but the financial stipend that we offer them doesn't come close to the dedication and the amount of work that they put into it. We have asked, like when the fellows first joined, I sent out a letter to all of their principals and their superintendents, letting them know about the program and asking for permission to borrow them from time to time so that we could have engagements with policymakers. And as a matter of fact, next week, we are going to the state capitol to talk to and present before the Education Committee. And we've been partnering with our own State Department of Education, right, forming relationships and talking about the working groups that we have. So in my fellowship right now, we have 4 major areas that the teachers are advocating for or beginning campaign initiatives around. One is early childhood education. Another is teacher preparation. The third one is social emotional learning and supporting the whole child. And then that final group is retention and recruitment and retention. And within each of these 4 big bucket areas, they all have or are still fine-tuning specific issues that they are addressing. With that recruitment and retention group, they are also interested more in retention than they are in recruitment, because we feel there's been a lot of focus on recruitment, and in our state we have they've increased beginning teacher salary pay. They're offering bonuses for certain areas, but very little has been done to support and encourage the teachers that are still there, and most of the teachers we found that are still there don't feel valued, and they would like opportunities to lead without necessarily leaving the classroom. One of the things that the State Department came up with, and it's actually been 3 years now, maybe 4, was we have what's called a lead and master teacher distinction on our, we could get a lead or master teacher distinction on our license, but right now that's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily correlate with any financial incentive statewide. Some districts may offer you something for it, other districts don't, so it's not a universal thing. And that's one of the things that the recruitment and retention group is interested in, trying to find ways to improve those policies, because they feel that just like with nationally board certified teachers, well, I'm assuming in North Carolina you all do this as well, but in Arkansas, not only do the teachers that are nationally board certified have a step increase on their pay scale, the state and the district also the state covers the cost for it, and our districts match that additional stipend. But it's only for national board certification, and we have all of these other endorsements and certification pathways that teachers have been a part of that don't necessarily come with financial advancements, and that's what they're one of the things that they're working to overcome. I don't know if I end up going on a whole different tangent, but that's what I got.
No, that was very helpful. Thank you. Any other questions from the room? Well, Stacy, we just want to thank you. So great to see you and to hear your voice, and very appreciative for you sharing your journey and many of the initiatives that you're working on. And I will see you at the reunion.
Oh, I can't wait. Thank you guys again for letting me come in. And I'm really serious. If there's anything that I can do or any person that I can connect you with, I may not have the answers, but I know someone who does. And earlier in the presentation, when I talked about being bridge builders, one of the things that I always refer to myself as is a connector. I love people. I'm a hoarder of relationships, and I love to connect. So if you ever need me for anything, I'm a phone call, email away. So thank you.
Ms. McAdoo, this is Eric Davis. I want to add my thanks to Ms. McKinney's of first, your sharing your life experiences and the wisdom you've gained from those experiences that you've shared with us, and also the ideas and strategies and so forth that you're leading in Arkansas, which are certainly worthy of our consideration and, in my opinion, adoption. So we're going to try to copy many of the things you're doing, and we wish you all the best. Thanks so much.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And like I said, I can send over any files, reports, or even the recruitment strategy if you want me to get with Dr. Townsend Smith and share those with her, and she can maybe get them to you. However and whatever, I'm here and available.
That'd be great. Thank you so much. All right. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, colleagues, next we have an opportunity to learn more about resource allocation and the role it can play in ensuring education for all of our students across the state. And we're joining us today are partners with Ed Trust. And at this time, I recognize Ms. Morgan and Mr. Ruffins for this part of our agenda.
Thank you for having us. My name is Ivy Morgan. I am the Associate Director for Analytics on the P-12 policy team at the Education Trust. And Ed Trust is a national advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. We advocate for improved educational equity, particularly for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds, all the way from early childhood education up through, sort of post-secondary college in particular. And we do that through a combination of, sort of national and federal advocacy directly with, the Department of Education and, the Hill, but also through supporting state-based advocates in a number of states. And Rob is much more deeply involved in that work. And so I'll turn it over to him to introduce himself and say anything else he wants to say about that.
Hi, Ivy did a great job explaining what the Education Trust does, so I'm not sure I have that much to add. Hello, my name is Robert Ruffins. I'm a Senior Associate of National and State Partnerships. And as Ivy said, we as the Education Trust work at a lot of levels. We work at the local, state, and federal level. And one of our jobs is to work with folks like yourself, policymakers, advocates, folks who are in position to craft and implement policy that's going to create more equitable outcomes, in particular for low-income students and students of color. And so we're really happy to be here today to talk about this issue of resource equity, which I think is an issue that's always been important, but it is one that I think the pandemic in particular has brought to bear and created a different understanding of what the gaps often are around all of the things that students need, but has also created opportunities, both in terms of funds, and I also think in terms of energy around figuring out how we can not just recover from this pandemic, but how we can think about how we can perhaps reform our systems so that we can become more resilient and more equitable in the long term.
Okay, and with that, I'll go ahead and get started and share my screen. Find the right screen. I think you all can see the presentation. Is that right? Sort of full screen mode?
Yes, everything is good.
Great. Okay. All right. Yeah, so we're here to talk about resource equity, but particularly how that relates to school funding systems. So here's a quick overview of how I'd like to spend the time. First, I'm going to introduce the framework that we use to think about resource equity. And share some real examples of how inequities in resources, sort of can be connected back to the way that states fund schools. I'll share some more specific sort of weedy information about how we think about state funding formulas and how they work. And then I will walk you through a tool that can help you sort of put all of those ideas and recommendations together. Okay, so how do we think about resource equity and its connection to school funding? The key thing to take away here is that we think about resource equity in terms of both how much and how well. What we mean by that is that school systems need money, right? That is critically important. And so that's generally the first sort of dimension that we think about. But money's not everything that they need. Money's not the sort of end of the conversation, the end of the story. Students need things like strong school leadership, engaging instruction, positive school climate, strong educators, things like that. And so the dimensions of equity framework, which includes the 10 dimensions that you see on the screen here. We developed this with Education Resource Strategies, which is a nonprofit consulting firm that works a lot with school districts to understand how they're allocating resources and how they can do it more equitably. This framework really is about focusing on the aspects of a student experience in school that help them the most. And to us, when we have achieved educational resource equity, it means that schools, systems, communities are all working together to mobilize the right combination of resources to create high quality learning experiences for all students. And like I said, right, so money is very important, right? I tend to think about that as the foundation. And, we often ask, is there enough of it? But we also, just as important, right, probably more importantly, we have to ask if we're spending it on the things that will make a difference for students' experiences and student outcomes. And, when we sort of think about the resource equity challenges that we see within schools, across districts, sometimes it really is the district's or the school's inability to allocate resources that students need. Sometimes that inability, that challenge is actually because of the state's funding system. And so what you see on the screen here are all real challenges that we've seen in the headlines in the past few years. These are sort of real challenges that we've seen in Oklahoma, Delaware, and Idaho. So in Oklahoma, for example, right, we've heard headlines, we've heard stories about teachers leaving the state for better paying jobs in other states like Texas, right? In particular, I think the teacher of the year one year in Oklahoma left and sort of very public about that and left Oklahoma to go work in Texas because the pay was better there. In Delaware, we work with advocates in Delaware, and one of the things that we've talked about with them is that there just aren't enough school counselors in the state, right? Delaware is a very small state. There are 18,000 students in Delaware that are enrolled in schools that don't have counselors at all. And 1 in 5 students in the state is enrolled in a school that doesn't have a sort of sufficient number of counselors, that 250 to 1 ratio that's recommended by the American School Counselor Association. And in Idaho, we've seen schools struggle to properly serve increasing numbers of special education students with disabilities. And, these and similar problems, are a real challenge in schools and districts across the country. But they're really not just problems about hiring more counselors or changing teacher contracts or the sort of changes in student demographics that schools and districts are seeing. These are all problems that we can directly connect to the state school funding system. Here's what I mean by that. So in Oklahoma, one of the challenges is that the formula just doesn't allocate very much state money per student. And on top of that, the state formula sort of system prohibits districts from raising additional money on top of that, right? So districts just can't do a whole lot to offer incentives to teachers to keep them in the state when they see better opportunities just across the state line. In Delaware, the very, very sort of like rigid funding formula that says it's a resource-based system, much like North Carolina's, but it says that, you District A, you get this specific set of resources and you have no flexibility to, sort of move things around and acquire different resources based on your students' needs, so that rigidity in the state's funding formula means that the staff funding that districts get has to be spent in specific ways. And there's no way to prioritize counselors over other sort of like, you know, school staff, teachers, school leaders, things like that, if that is what's needed most. And in Idaho, what we see there is that actually, you know, there is funding for students with disabilities in the state, but the way that the state funding formula works is that it assumes that every single district has 6% of the students are students with disabilities in the district, and doesn't take into account any additional information about the specific share of students in that district, whether it's 4% or 13% or something else. And it also doesn't take into account the cost of providing services to meet those students' needs. And so, if a district had, sort of to provide a super simple example, all of its, students but needed speech language services, it gets the same amount as a district where, its students actually need, one-on-one support with, sort of full-time aides. The funding formula just does not account for that. And, we see similar issues, right? We see issues like this in North Carolina too. The, comprehensive remedial plan talks very specifically about how the education system, the funding system, isn't meeting the needs of students with disabilities, of English learners, of students from low-income backgrounds, in part, right, because there's either not enough additional funding, there are caps on how much additional funding can be provided, or there are prescriptive restrictions on what that additional funding can be used for. So that's it, right? Funding matters. I hope I've made a pretty clear case that, like, the challenges that we see in broader resource equity, in the sort of, actual experiences that students are having in schools can be connected back to the state's funding formula. That is what I'm going to spend the rest of the time here talking about. Funding formulas, right? There's lots of advocacy, right? We're involved in lots of advocacy in the sort of education funding space, and lots of those conversations focus on appropriations, right? On how much funding there is, trying to get the state to invest more money in education overall. And, that's important, right? We're never going to be in a place to say, no, we should not provide more resources for our education systems. But lots of the challenges really are related not to the amount of money, or not just the amount of money, but to policy specifics about how the money is handed out and what it can be used for, right? So the state's funding formula and sort of the rules that are prescribed by that. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the super weedy details that frame how we think about state funding formulas and the main components of them, to provide a foundation that we can sort of use a common language a little bit to go through the tool and talk about the lots of the other sort of equity-focused considerations of funding formulas. The goal here is to give this foundation and then use the tool, go through the tool so that you guys know about it and have that as a resource, when the conversations in the state sort of shift to talking about more whole-scale funding system reform. Okay, so every state, right, has a funding formula in some way, shape, or form, whether it's student-based or resource-based or whatever. And generally, right, that's written into state statute, right? So it's the legislature who makes the rules here. Generally speaking, these formulas that states have three big steps. One, the state uses a formula to sort of determine how much money each district needs for the year. This is what we tend to call like the target amount, the target allocation for each district. So the state decides how much money in total the district needs. Then the state almost always has a way of determining how much money each local school district can reasonably contribute based on local revenue sources. It's, sort of worth noting right here that North Carolina is an exception because instead of sort of specifying that districts need a total amount and then North Carolina will kick in the rest, this way that the state's funding formula works right now is by, sort of the state funds instruction, right, sort of daily operations, and then districts are responsible for maintenance and facilities and things like that. So it's a little bit different in North Carolina's case. But generally, this is sort of how it works across the board. And then the rest of the funding is provided in state aid. So once the state determines how much is needed, it determines how much districts can contribute, and then it kicks in the rest of that. And so, like I said, right, I've mentioned a couple of times, right, there are 3 different sort of formula types that we think about. We tend to, recommend student-based systems, and so you'll notice that in sort of how I'm talking about how school funding formulas work, that it's sort of rooted in a student-based system, a student-weighted funding formula system in particular. But there are also resource-based systems where a state will say, every district needs this number of teachers per student in a school. Every school needs a principal. Every school needs, a certain amount of funding for other sort of in-classroom resources, right? And that's generally the kind of formula that North Carolina has. There are also a few states that have program-based systems. There's just one state right now that has this sort of entirely program-based system. That's Wisconsin. North Carolina, like, even though it's primarily a resource-based system, it does combine, specific elements of the student-based system and the program. It's got primarily resource-based system, combines elements of a student-based system and a program-based system. And so that's an area that makes North Carolina a little different from other states. If you sort of see the shading in North Carolina in this map, it is very unlike. It's not like any of the other states across the country. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the 3 sort of policy levers, and then we'll get to the fun part, I promise. So the first major policy lever that exists, right, is thinking about setting the formula allocation amount. And so when you're thinking about changing the school funding system, this is where a lot of the energy is spent, right? Improving the sort of equation or set of rules that sets the target amount for each district. And there are lots of nuances here for how each state arrives at that total target number for each district. We ask questions like, what should be part of the calculation? How much funding is needed per student? We ask questions like, how should the funding system account for students with specific needs, right? Going back to the Idaho challenge that I mentioned earlier, right? That's a really great example of like how that conversation can go. Ohio decided to, right, like assume basically that 6% of students had a need for special education services in that fund in their system and funded the districts that way. And that's a trade-off that you can make, right? The folks in Idaho decided to go this more simple route, and simplicity has its benefits. But in this case, right, it's sort of at the cost of adequacy and at the cost of equity, right? That decision to prioritize simplicity just has like sort of downstream effects, right, and result in districts not being able to serve their students with disabilities well. And then third question is how the funding system should account for differences in local conditions, right? A rural district, for example, might face very different transportation challenges than an urban district. And so thinking about how transportation fits in, or if there are additional allocations for districts that are geographically sparse, also factor into this sort of like setting the formula amount part of the conversation. And then, sort of all of these decisions come together, combined with estimates of how much the resources cost, and that sets the target allocation for each district. So the second major policy lever that you'd want to consider is refining step 2, right? Calculating the local share, improving the process or decisions about how much districts contribute compared to how much the state kicks in. And this is important, right? Because not every district has the same ability to raise local dollars for education. If the state doesn't consider that, right, and just provides, say, half of the sort of target amount automatically, then some districts would really struggle to make up the other half, while other districts would very easily be able to cover that and then some. And so the way that this works in most states is that the state has like an expected sort of uniform local tax rate. Let's say it's 1%, 5%, 3%, something like that. That rate, right, is applied to the local, usually property tax base. And it would raise more in a property wealthy district than it would in a property poor district. And so this sort of calculation and then factoring in how much districts can raise from sort of the same levels of effort, right? That same 1% tax rate, and then figuring out what the state does about that. That is a process that we generally call equalization. And then, so the considerations, right, the questions that you ask here, right, are what is a reasonable tax rate? Is it 1%? Is it 3%? Is it something else? And then there are some other considerations, right? What other revenue, in addition to property tax, right, do districts have access to? Should there be a consideration of local income levels? Should there be any sort of minimum or maximum amount that the state kicks in or that school districts kick in? And I think, right, North Carolina policies, even though there isn't like an expected contribution, there is like a supplemental allocation for low wealth districts that takes into consideration a lot of these questions or factors. And then the third major policy lever that you might want to consider is addressing what we call a local revenue loophole. And this is really about setting guardrails to prevent underfunding or overfunding of the local share, right? So I mentioned earlier that like with a 1% tax rate, some districts might really struggle to like kick in their expected contribution. And other districts could, sort of raise their expected contribution very easily. And some states have mechanisms in place to sort of require districts to kick in what they're expected, or more commonly, sort of the anti, like the thing that we see that is counter to equity is that their wealthy districts are kicking in more than they're required, and there are no limits. The state doesn't set limits on what they do, and so wealthier districts can just keep spending more and more and more and more, and other districts have a really hard time sort of keeping up with that. And states can play a role. Some states do play a role in sort of setting limits, so we don't see that kind of runaway spending in particular with wealthy districts. But I'm not going to say more about that here because this isn't super relevant for North Carolina's context, given how local revenue is structured. But I will say that I'm going to talk about a little bit about Common Sense and Fairness, which is a report that has lots of policy recommendations around these areas. And if you guys are interested in that, you should check that report out there. So I feel like actually that was a lot, and I don't know how you guys have been structuring previous sessions, but I feel like I should pause for questions here. So let's do that.
Any questions from my colleagues? Seeing none, I think we'll carry on.
Okay, great. Okay, so that was quite a bit on sort of like just structurally how we think about how funding formulas like are put together, sort of stitched together from all of the various components. But to what end, right? What are we trying to accomplish, right? What we are trying to accomplish is improved resource equity, right? Improved fiscal equity, improved allocation. And so when we're thinking about improving, sort of making sure that districts have the resources that they need to meet their students' needs, we think about these 4 principles that you see on the screen, right? Adequacy, equity, responsibility, and transparency. And there are lots of evaluative questions that you can ask about any state's allocation system, sort of aligned with those 4 buckets, right? So in terms of adequacy, right, the question is there enough funding? You can ask additional questions about like where that funding comes from, whether the state kicks it in, whether the districts have to kick it in, what share of the total state spending is spent on education, right? Questions like that are related to adequacy. Equity, when we're thinking about that, we're really interested in understanding if funding varies sort of like strategically based on student and community need, right? So like, are we providing more funding for students from low-income backgrounds, for English learners, but also are we providing more funding for the districts that have less capacity to raise local revenue? And then, sort of related to that, right, is the responsibility shared fairly between states and districts? When we're thinking about responsibility, the primary questions that we ask here are, do district leaders have flexibility in how they fund schools? Does the state provide the money to districts in a way that like allows, district leader autonomy in terms of allocating resources? And then similarly, right, do school leaders have flexibility in how they budget? And then the last one here is transparency, right? Is it clear how allocations are made for different students and communities? Are all of those decisions that come together to outline the way that the formula is structured, are those decisions clear? Is it sort of like easily accessible information? And do we see is it also easy to understand sort of the dollars behind that and sort of where the money actually goes? And as I understand it, right, these sort of principles are pretty well aligned with how you all are thinking about how to improve school funding in North Carolina, right? So the comprehensive remedial plan calls for a system that is adequate, equitable, and predictable. And I would say that sort of predictability, I would consider that as a thing that's related to transparency, right? If it is predictable, then it is easy to understand how changes in various inputs will change allocations for districts. And then in terms of responsibility, right, as I understand it, there is a pretty, one of the things that we think about here is giving leaders flexibility in exchange for sort of additional accountability for how those funds were used and the outcomes that we're seeing based on those sort of additional, like based on the additional flexibility afforded by the state's funding system. And then just to sort of put this a different way, right? Like I talked about the questions that we ask. I just want to put a fine point and sort of restate again some of the things that we're specifically looking for, right? What are the answers to those questions? And so we think about the ways to advance equity in state funding systems and sort of with these 5 recommendations. It's just one of the many ways that we think about it. One, right, is provide adequate funding according to student need, provide more funding to districts with low property wealth, ensure that dollars are used well to improve student learning experiences and outcomes, be transparent about the way the system is designed and monitor the funding that's going to districts, and then share clear and transparent data about the amount of funding that schools actually get. Right, and so the first 2 like things are really both about adequacy and equity. Is there enough money in the system, and is it allocated well to meet student and community needs? The third one really is about responsibility, and then the fourth and fifth ones are about transparency. And with that framework in mind, I just want to talk through, sort of how we understand the power balance to exist when we're trying to change state funding systems to achieve these goals. So for the first one, right, providing adequate funding according to student need, we really, right, the state legislature really has the power here to write the funding system, to allocate dollars, right, to meet the requirements outlined in that funding system. When we're thinking about providing more funding to districts with low property wealth, similarly, really it's the state legislature that has the power here, also in the way that the state funding formula is written into law. Ensuring that dollars are used well to improve student learning experiences and outcomes. Here, I think it depends, right, on the particular context in the state. State legislatures can write in more ambitious and equity-oriented requirements for getting state funding when they, pass funding formula legislation. But also, right, equity-oriented state leaders, whether it's the state education agency or the state board of education, can find ways to require similar kinds of actions by districts, right? Through, sort of both with like flow through federal funding and state funding, and can sort of really set the requirements, requiring districts to have plans for how they're going to spend the funding. Those are ways that the SEA can put into place additional requirements that that help improve responsibility, even in cases when it's not specifically written to law. So we think both the legislature and the SEA or State Board of Education have power here. Being transparent about, the system's design and monitoring fundings going to districts. We think this is something that either the legislature or the state education agency or the State Board of Education could easily do, right? So just to use a specific example here, right? This kind of transparency could be a requirement, right? Legislation could direct the state education agency to release like documents and analyze data to understand inequities or distribution of funding across districts. Or it is something that, that state leaders could just decide to do. So in Maryland, for example, there are researchers and analysts that support the state legislature, and they make information about, how the funding system is designed, how it is like actually achieving its goals in terms of dollar allocations. They make that information sort of, easy to find and publicly accessible. But Illinois is another example where they, sort of folks in the state education agency took the initiative to, this is actually in context of the ESSA fiscal transparency requirement, so it's a little related to the next slide, took the initiative to really make equity focused decisions about how they were going to report information about funding going to districts, about how funding going to schools aligned with the like adequacy targets that are set in the state's funding formula. And that was, sort of all the SEA and the State Board of Education there. And right, similarly, this is basically the same point, right? Transparent information, data about how the system's supposed to work, and then the amount of funding that schools are actually going to get. Similarly, we think about the state legislature and the SEA as having like could share power, or in certain places one could sort of wield more authority in achieving those goals. Okay. So let's talk about putting this into action. So I want to talk at a super high level through 3 tools that you can use to take the recommendations to, read the more specific, detailed recommendations about how we think school funding systems should be structured, and sort of what are the equity-focused components of them, but also to pull those pieces together, right? So learn about the recommendations, but also pull those pieces together to design a funding system that you think is like ideal based on the considerations in North Carolina's context. So the first one that I'll talk about is Funded, right? This has been around for 5 years or so, 6 years or so. And so it may be a tool that you've seen before. It is a database of all 50 states' funding formula policies, divided both by state and by topic. And so, for example, you could go to that address there on the screen and see all of North Carolina's policies, around the funding formula structure, around how much additional funding gets allocated for students with disabilities or English learners, around what the expectations are about school districts contributing to the sort of target amount that the state has set. Or you can see all 50 states' policies for a specific topic, like additional, like funding for gifted education, for example. And I will say the information that's in that tool right now is from 2018. That was the last update. We are actively preparing a new update that should be ready around the beginning of next year, around the beginning of 2022. But Funded was purely informational, right? It gives information about what states are doing, and it doesn't say anything. It doesn't say anything about what we think about that. But when we're having conversations about school funding formulas, right, we often want to know who's doing it right? Who has the best model that we can adopt for our state? Right, and so like in North Carolina, as you think about allocating additional funding to meet the needs of students from low-income backgrounds, English learners, students with disabilities in the short term, or transitioning to a weighted student funding system in the longer term, right? It's helpful to have information about what states are doing. But Funded doesn't have information about sort of who is doing it right. And really the answer is that no one is doing all of it right. But for every part of the funding formula policy that we think about, there is an exemplar state to look to. And so that's where common sense and fairness comes in. It is a report that attempts to bring together sort of the best bits and pieces from all the states across the country in terms of what they're doing with their funding formulas, and identify sort of like model, right, exemplar policies for every part of the funding formula that we think about. And then the report includes references for where you can find similar policies in state law around the country. And all of these resources, I should say, were developed by EdBuild, which is an organization that focused very exclusively on school funding formulas and like what we could do to make them more equitable. Common Sense and Fairness in particular was developed by EdBuild in consultation with EdTrust, right, the organization that we work for, and Education Resource Strategies, and the organization that I mentioned at the top of our session here. EdBuild has since closed, and so we are stewarding the continued outreach and dissemination of these products into the world. And so the long form Common Sense and Fairness report is accompanied by a companion website called EdBuilder. And that is an interactive tool that's designed to really walk through those key components that we've talked about, that we cover in funded, that we cover in common sense and fairness, and really help you put together the set of policy pieces or components that make sense, given the goals that you might have in North Carolina. And so common sense and fairness can be helpful if you're thinking about whole-scale funding system reform. It can also be helpful if you're just looking to address one or two specific areas in your funding system policy. So what we've got on the screen here are the specific 11 elements that that common sense and fairness talks about, and that are built into the Ed Builder tool that I'll walk through in a minute. Grouped into 4 buckets, right? Formula fundamentals, so like, what is the formula type? Is it a student-based, is it a student-weighted funding system? Is it a resource-based system? Is it a program-based system? And then for a weighted student system, what's the base amount? Different student characteristics that states tend to provide additional funding for. Students from low-income backgrounds, English learners, students with disabilities, students in certain grade levels, and students in gifted programs. What are the district characteristics that are considered in the funding formula? Is there additional funding for districts that are geographically sparse or isolated? Are there adjustments for sort of within state differences in cost of living across the state, things like that? And then how is local revenue structured? So you can go, sort of right to each of these individual sections in the report and learn about, sort of what we think are the best practices in school funding policy. Common sense and fairness generally has 3 tiers of recommendations. We try to provide options for all of them, although we don't actually achieve that with all of them. And I'll talk specifically about some of what those are. But we recognize, sort of that state leaders have different goals in mind. There are different needs across states. There are different political contexts across states. And so we try to provide recommendations in these 3 tiers, right? There's a silver tier that represents sort of like what we think is the baseline of good equity-oriented policy, and practices that generally have many precedents around the country. So it is a thing that we see states commonly do. There are gold recommendations, which are a little bit stronger. They're a little bit more ambitious. And generally they are uncommon, and they sort of only exist in, 1 or 2 or 3 leading states. And then in a lot of the areas, we also offer what we call a moonshot recommendation. And the moonshot recommendations really are about offering a path for states that are really seeking to break new ground in equity and school funding policy, and really push further towards, a policy ideal. And generally, I would say, the way to think about moonshots is that they are the places where you really focus on the highest priority policies in the state. Because there's a trade-off here, right? Like, moonshot policies will get you towards a more equitable policy, a more precise policy, but they're also always more complex, which has trade-offs between predictability and transparency. So just to provide a super sort of specific example, right? These are recommendations that we've got for English learners. So the silver recommendation in this bucket for this element would be providing a generous amount of supplemental funding for every English learner. The gold recommendation would provide supplemental funding for English learners in 3 tiers, right? So different amounts of funding for students based on their level of proficiency, where students with lower levels of proficiency receive more funding from the formula. And then we also think that, you know, addressing diseconomies of scale would be helpful, right? So districts that serve small numbers of English learners should also receive more funding. The moonshot policy here builds on the gold, but is a little bit more precise, right? So here we're also saying provide additional funding for students with lower levels of English proficiency, and additional funding to support the needs of students whose native language is not that common in the district, right? Because providing that kind of support requires, you know, sort of even more resources. And then on top of that, the Moonshot recommendation here asks or suggests for additional data collection on students' limited or interrupted formal education to start to account for that too in this kind of policy. Okay, I'm going to pause for questions here again before I dig into the tool.
Any questions? Yes, Dr. Taylor.
Yes, when you talk about the silver, gold, and moonshot recommendations, are there any states that have taken steps towards redoing their school financing, and what kind of difficulties may they have faced in the process?
So I will say that this is a new tool specifically. So I don't know about any states sort of like using this framework, this tool, to advance change for their specific school funding systems. But, you know, we can talk a little bit. Actually, Rob, do you want to talk a little bit about Maryland and the work there? I'll start off by saying that we have done a lot of work to support advocates in Maryland to change their school funding system. That was brought on by a requirement that was written into law by the legislature, right? That the state review its school funding system, like basically every like student generation-ish, right? 10 years or
Yeah,
so.
it was 10 years. So just to give a little context about Maryland, which I think is actually a really good example of a way a state kind of looked beyond dollars to really think about like what do we really need about resources, right? Because I tell folks like dollars is actually a tool, right, to get resources. You know, dollars don't teach kids, but they buy the things that do if spent correctly. And so, as Ivy said, Maryland, much like North Carolina in the 90s, was grappling around this question of like adequacy. And there is in fact a lawsuit called people refer to it as the Bradford case in Maryland. That was around the idea of constitutional adequacy of education. And this led Maryland in 2002, I believe, to pass a bill called the Bridge to Excellent Schools Act, which was really focused around how do we change the funding formula to provide adequacy and equity for all students. And as a part of that bill, they had to revisit their funding formula every 10 years. And that got delayed a little bit because of the Great Recession, which happened obviously between 2001, 2002, and now. But around 2016, they convened a commission to revisit the funding formula. And what's interesting about what they did in 2016 versus what they did in 2002 is that they didn't just limit it to what are the changes we need to make to the funding formula. They actually brought into how can we create a policy framework that's going to allow Maryland to be competitive with the top states in the world. And so funding more resources for students was one of the areas they looked at, but they also looked at governance and accountability. They also looked at how you could elevate the teaching profession to have teachers who are in the profession be better compensated, better trained, and have more options for growth inside the teaching profession, as well as how do you rethink college and career readiness? How do you get more kids college and career ready earlier and give them more options while in high school to pursue their college or career interests, as well as expanding early childhood education. And even inside of all of those things, it wasn't just simply allotments, right? They didn't just say, for example, well, we want to expand, put more money towards college and career readiness. They said, well, we're going to not lower, but try to get all students college and career ready by the 10th grade as opposed to by 12th grade. We're going to provide specific supports and tutoring for any student who's not at that college and career readiness standard by the 10th grade. We're going to create an entire, essentially, college and high school program for students who meet college and career readiness. And so that students who can pursue internships, they can pursue dual enrollment programs or AP and IB programs, all at little to no cost to them. And so I think it's like interesting as like thinking about like what does a moonshot actually look like? And part of what it comes from is really thinking about, as I would say, like tracing the full path of the dollar, right? You know, not just saying, well, let's just have a bigger allotment for this or just increase the funding for districts. But let's think about how we can like integrate this into a more holistic framework that identifies student need, that thinks about the particular interventions as well as the accountability needed to make sure those interventions happen, and the requirement both of very clear development of plans on the front end, both to ensure equity, to make sure that the dollars are going to be used in a timely way, as well as a plan for how you're going to measure progress towards those things on the back end and revisit them periodically. And so I think that while this doesn't perhaps I wouldn't say that everything in Maryland qualifies as a moonshot. I think the kind of intentionality of the moonshot recommendations here was built in, but there were challenges, right? You know, on some level, it's both politically popular in some ways, and legislatively easier to say, we're just going to increase the amount of money towards this thing, right? You know, one of the things that, you know, we found working across the country is that many folks are excited about more dollars. They are less excited for the okay, and so what is the accountability for those dollars, right? What is the plan you need on the front end to get those dollars? What does the monitoring of those look like? How are we going to, you know, prioritize equity inside of those dollars? That is an often trickier conversation. It's tricky at the state to district level, right? In terms of the state saying, hey, this is new state funding. Here's what we think you should do with it. It's challenging at the district level when you have, you know, all of the schools that may be in a given school district, and all of the priorities that may happen at the school level, which may not be the same priorities that the district is set, which may not be the same priorities that the state is set. And so there are certainly trade-offs, but I think that the thing that we've learned from the real world example of Maryland is that the intentionality on the front end, right, of saying we want to make sure that like we aren't just putting dollars into a system, into our existing system, but we're trying to do more and better in terms of our spending at the same time. And we're willing to set clear goals as well as a clear accountability system to make sure that we get there. Questions? Hopefully that's helpful in terms of, you know, an example of how a state that has actually kind of attempted moonshots, aspires for moonshots, and I think in many ways is, I don't know if they've landed on the moon yet, but they're certainly they're on the right. I was not a physicist. That's why I was an English teacher, but they're on the right trajectory, I guess. You know, if they are to land on the moon, they'd have to kind of start the way they started.
Other questions? Seeing none, back to you.
Okay. Okay, so I want to do a quick demo of the actual tool that I've mentioned a couple of times here. Let me pull this over. Can you guys now see a website?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so here is this is the Ed Builder. If you want to follow along, you can just go to this address. If you just type that in, that will work. You'll see that it says that it's not secure. I promise it is. It's just that with EdBuild having closed its doors, with EdBuild having closed its doors, it's just been a little bit tough to get the security certificate fixed. I promise it's safe. Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. It looks like my Chrome window went away. But the thing that I'll flag while I pull that back up is that if you go to the website, it like very sort of clearly walks you through the steps that you would need to consider to pull in and sort of select recommendations for all of the elements that I've been talking about, right? Like sort of align with the adequacy, equity, responsibility, and transparency principles. So you click, go to the builder, begin, and you can select the formula type and structure here that you'd like for your system. I will flag here, right? Generally, we've got recommendations and sort of options for every, we've got options for every element. Here in the formula type and structure, we don't, because actually our recommendation is to have a weighted student funding formula. It is absolutely possible to achieve equity with the resource-based system, but there are substantial trade-offs in terms of predictability and transparency, I think in particular, and then over time with equity and adequacy that just make weighted student funding formulas our sort of go-to recommendation here, right? It is much easier to sort of set the formula, do all of the work to set the formula at the front end, and then make adjustments to individual components that sort of just get multiplied by other things as you go forward. And that's just really helpful for transparency and predictability. So aligned with that, right, there is just a recommendation for a base amount that it should, sort of reflect the costs of educating a single student, every student in the state, and then it should be uniform statewide. So I'm just gonna plus those. We're gonna add those to our formula that we've built. And then as you go throughout, you get these little messages that sort of, tell you you've completed a section, or sometimes there are warnings that I'll demonstrate. So in each of the 4 buckets, right, formula fundamentals, student characteristics, district characteristics, and local revenue over here, we've got individual elements. So you can go through each section. There's a little bit of explanatory text, that says why this is important at a high level, and then for each specific element here. And then you can go through and identify and sort of choose which recommendation you want to go through. And so just for the sake of illustrating, I'm going to go through right now and choose a bunch of moonshot policies. Now, this is not actually feasible, right? My warning before that moonshots are, they are precise and they are equitable, but they are complicated. And so if you sort of do that too much, then you get this little message, friendly message, right? It's like, congratulations, you're aiming high, but you might want to think about this, right? And take a step back. And so, but it doesn't stop you, right? I could keep going. So we'll turn those off. The other thing that I want to flag for you is as you're going through, right? If you're sort of basically not really ambitious enough and are choosing policies that, are good baseline standards for equity and are common across lots of states, then you'll be encouraged to, choose more ambitious policies as you're going through to achieve a good balance of sort of an equity forward system that is also ambitious at sort of closing the opportunity and achievement gaps that we are all working so hard to combat. The other place where there is no recommendation is with the gold recommendation. The cost of living recommendation. We just have a sort of gold standard here, which is it's set at it's sort of described as a gold recommendation because it is not something that we see commonly across states, but to not adjust for differences in cost of living between areas in the state. There are other ways to provide additional funding to account for sort of different costs of living, and in particular how that sort of plays out in teacher salaries, right? Providing additional funding for students from low-income backgrounds or English learners so that you can provide a salary incentives, right, for teachers to go teach in certain districts or sort of in high poverty districts or in rural districts, things like that. Completed that section, and then the last section is this local revenue section. I'm just randomly choosing things at the moment. But as I mentioned before, right, the sort of full recommendations are available on the website, right, in this full recommendations report. But you can also download a report, a sort of summary report that outlines all of the choices that you made after you go through the builder. And so there's a version for an executive summary that just sort of presents at a very high level all of the options that are available. But there's an option here to download your specific recommendations, right? So this is the actual policy that I indicated as I went through and selected all of the options. And you can pull that together here, and it's got like specific citations to state statutes that describe those state examples of the policy that you've chosen, and you'll see that there generally aren't citations for the moonshot policies. You can download a report that has all of the gold elements, right? It really is a sort of choose your own adventure and presenting all of the options that are available to you. So that's it. That is the Ed Builder tool. Oh, and you've got this option to actually save your changes, I believe, and come back and sort of start over again too, which is why I got that warning. And that's it.
Well, thank you, Ms. Morgan and Mr. Ruffins. We appreciate the ideas and perspectives that you shared with us. They're definitely worthy of our reflection as well as consideration of this tool you've shown us. Resource allocation is an important aspect of our strategy, and we appreciate what you've presented to us today. Any last questions for our partners on this item? Okay, seeing none, thank you so much. We hope you have a good day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, team, it's just before noon and we'll take a break for lunch and reconvene at 1 o'clock.